and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. So, since the start of this century, polar bears have been the icon for all that is worrying about global warming, human-caused global warming, and the decline of sea ice that's blamed on climate change. And because of the so-called Arctic amplification effect, we're told that the Arctic is warming twice as fast as anywhere else, and the mighty polar bear is the canary in the coal mine for climate change. In 2000, Time magazine devoted an issue to what they called the Arctic meltdown and proclaimed the polar bear in extreme danger, as well as the rest of us, if something wasn't done. And in 2006, another special issue suggesting that we should not be just worried, but very worried. Now, there's been concerns about polar bear status for quite a while, and it's probably difficult for most people to remember when and why it all started. So let me just give you a kind of timeline of how it all began. So in 1968, the Polar Bear Specialist Group was put together as part of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, who about that time had started to put out what they called the Red List of Threatened and Endangered Species. So in 1973, the Polar Bear Specialist Group helped to broker an international treaty that gave protection to polar bears from overhunting, which had been a very real threat to their survival for the past few decades. However, it wasn't until 1982 that the polar bear was officially given the classification of vulnerable on the Red List. And it held that position until 1996, when it became clear that the population had rebounded substantially. It had about doubled from the numbers that had been estimated in about 1960. And then it was clear that the polar bear had been saved, and it stayed at this lower risk, or what's now called least concern status, for 10 years. However, I don't think very many people heard about that status change. And it was very clear from reading their reports that the Polar Bear Specialist Group were not happy to have their species of concern demoted. And so in 2005, they suggested to the Red List folks that the polar bear be reinstated to vulnerable status based on sea ice projections, based on global warming predictions that would threaten future population numbers. And the Red List folks duly accepted the recommendation, and the polar bear was bumped back up to vulnerable in 2006. Now, in their press release announcing the newest additions of, 530 new species that were going to be added to the Red List that year, the Red List featured two well-known species. The polar bear, which had been predicted based on climate models to decline 30% over the next 45 years, and the common hippo, which had suffered a recent decline of 95% in the Congo. And without irony, then, both were listed as vulnerable, one based on an actual catastrophic decline in numbers, and the other on a prophecy. Now, it's important to remember that this actually was a real first. It had never been done before to actually base a conservation status on this future threats concept. The IUCN had never done it before, and neither had anyone else. And polar bears were really a test case, but the IUCN accepted the recommendations from the polar bear specialist group members as if there was a scientific analysis involved in it. But in fact, there was not. It was based purely on their opinion. The next year, biologists at the US Geological Survey came out with a number of predictions that decided that most polar bears in the world would be dead by 2050, when the sea ice would decline. Now, they actually did go through an extensive analysis that were published in US government reports, and they used one particular biologist opinion about polar bears that were focused exclusively on summer sea ice changes. Now, the reason that the focus was on summer sea ice was that the predictions for spring, fall, and winter, even up until 2100, the turn of the century, did not show any kind of significant declines. So that forced summer to be the focus of the biologist predictions, even if it wasn't biologically supported. And it's also important to note at this point that Stephen Amstrup, who was the head of this team doing this work, nor anyone else actually knew how polar bears would respond to much less sea ice than they had had, because it hadn't happened yet. They had to use their expert opinion and make assumptions about what would happen, and that's what was included in their models. And in May 2008, the polar bears were officially added to the US endangered species list, and the massive media coverage, of course, began. Now, the sea ice predictions for 2050 that this prediction was based upon for the polar bears, this is the prediction, one of them for about 2050 that was included in their government report. And here is one of the ones that from the similar time frame, so in 2005, a climate change assessment report. So you can see that they're very similar, and that's what was being used at the time for the polar bear survival predictions. Now, specifically, what they were saying was that 2/3 of the world's polar bears would disappear when summer sea ice dropped below about 5 million kilometer squares in 8 out of 10 years. And that constituted about a 42% decline from 1979 levels. This would have meant a loss of about 16,400 bears from the estimate that they were using of 24,500, and that would put it down to about 8,000. What this meant in geographical terms was that all of the bears in the purple area here, all the way from Svalbard to Western Canada, and all of the bears in these green areas in Eastern Canada and Hudson Bay were expected to disappear. That would have been 10 subpopulations out of the 19 that were monitored by the PBSG. Now, the problem was that the ice at September 2007 actually dropped to a level not expected until 2050. And you can see here that this is an image that was included in the peer-reviewed version of the USGS models that appeared in 2008. Now, this shows the ice chart for the September minimum in 2007, and this one shows, this is the September 2007 level. These are the 10 sea ice models that were used in their report, and what it's showing is that 5 out of the 2007 was lower than 5 out of the 10 best models that they were using for their sea ice predictions. And this was, we know that in fact, that Amstrup knew that this had happened even before the ink was dry in his report, because he included this image in his government report. It just has a different date. He used August 23rd, 2007, and used the same models and the line here for August 23rd was not quite as far over as it was in September, but the same essentially result. And what he said to explain the significance of this graphic is that because the ice had declined was so much worse than was predicted, that their prediction for the conservation or the status of the polar bears was that it was much more conservative, and that either that the bear numbers would decline sooner or that the decline would be much worse than they had suggested. Now, an important paper appeared just a couple of years later, and what it said was that the September minimum extent for 2007 and 2008 was at least 30 years earlier than expected. Now, this is important because Amstrup has challenged me by saying that those are not the numbers that they used. And in fact, they did. It's 30 years. We know that the ice dropped far sooner than they were expecting at the time. And at this point, their conclusion was that an ice-free Arctic by 2040 was in fact highly likely. And in this news report of this paper, Cassie Siegel, who was a conservation activist, was saying polar bears are going to drown, they're going to starve, they're going to resort to cannibalism, they're going to become extinct. Now, this last point, what she was hitting on was that the original USGS prediction was that by the time sea ice was ice-free in the Arctic at 2100, that they had predicted the bears would be extinct or nearly so. So then it became a new game of pretending that their original prediction had been that the bears would that the numbers would drop by 2/3 when the sea ice disappeared in the summer, not when it hit 3 to 5 million kilometers square. However, this is what happened. The ice didn't continue to decline or get worse. It stabilized. And in fact, the sea ice has been at those 2050 levels ever since. And in fact, if we go on from 2016, which is where I stopped my initial analysis, we see that 2017 to 2019 fit exactly the same pattern. And I'm not the only one who says so. US National Snow and Ice Data Center included this particular graphic in their report for September sea ice for 2019. They drew these trend lines and showed that the steepest trend in sea ice decline occurred between 1999 and 2012. And in fact, between 2007 and 2019, the trend has been virtually flat. However, polar bear numbers didn't decline as expected. And this is just a graph of the September sea ice between 1979 and 2016 compared to polar bear numbers. And what you see is the sea ice going down and polar bear numbers going up. This is 2005 when the numbers used for prediction, and this is what was going on in 2016. So the numbers didn't go up by much, but it's certainly not the catastrophic decline that was predicted. So one can only conclude that the models were spectacularly wrong. Not just the sea ice models, but the polar bear survival models. And what we're left with now, with current conditions, are fat, healthy polar bears throughout the Arctic and much less summer ice than there was in 1979. And in fact, this is a NASA image, and it's actually saying that the ice has reduced by nearly 50%. That's summer ice. Now, just to give you an example of the kind of response that has been going on with the bears, to let you know that triplet litters of bears are very rare outside Western Hudson Bay. Yet here we've got a photo of a set of triplets that was photographed in the southern Beaufort Sea in the summer of 2016. Here's another triplet litter. These are year-olds, so that this mother has got those bears through an entire year, all three of them. And they're all in good shape. Here's another set, from again in the Chukchi Sea, a female with triplet cubs on the shore of Wrangel Island. And the point is that when conditions are good, more females within the population are able to raise a triplet litter and to 9 months of age or older. And this actually is one of the mechanisms for a rapid population increase. We're not talking about all of the females in the population, but certainly some of them. Now, I think this maybe is an appropriate point to talk about starving bears. You might remember the image of the starving polar bear from Somerset Island in the Canadian Arctic that was made famous by National Geographic, who claimed that this is what climate change looked like. Now, what's remarkable about this was the amount of publicity it got, but also the amount of pushback. And eventually, they had to retract that statement and apologize because it was clearly, patently untrue. Bears starve when they're sick or injured. A number of reasons for this to happen. Young, inexperienced bears and old, weak bears may have trouble catching seals and or defending them from bigger, stronger bears. So there's an aspect of competition that goes on with bears that makes young bears and weak bears vulnerable. And if they can't catch or keep the seals that they catch, then they can starve. And in fact, starvation is the leading natural cause of death for polar bears. And the corollary of that is that a single starving bear does not tell you anything about how the population is doing. So let's go on and talk about why the models were so wrong. For one thing, it turned out that summer hunting was much less important than the models had assumed. And one of the reasons was that less ice was actually a benefit to the seals that polar bears eat. Ring seals and bearded seals, which are the primary prey species for polar bears, do most of their feeding in the ice-free season. So when that ice-free season is a bit longer, they have longer time to feed. That means they're in better condition going into the winter. More females are apt to give birth to pups the following spring, which is when polar bears really depend on them for their food source. We see in this captured image from a BBC video of a bear trying to catch a bearded seal when there is much broken ice and lots of open water during the summer. So there's still some ice around, and the seals still haul out to rest on the bits of ice. But it's much more difficult for the bears to catch seals under these circumstances. There's just many more ways for the seals to escape. And in fact, some bears don't even bother hunting. Their chances of success are so low. The other thing that came out was that spring hunting was then much more important than had been assumed by the models, which in fact didn't take spring into account at all. And therefore, spring sea ice conditions were much more important to survival of the bears than summer. So, and all of these points are supported by evidence in the peer-reviewed literature put together by polar bear biologists who are continuing to go out in the field, study these things and collecting the numbers. And these are the results that they have found. Now, I thought it important to sort of mention here that polar bears need fat to survive the months when there's no food to eat. And that happens in both summer and winter. And that makes the polar bears different from things like from brown bears, for example, who all members of that species hibernate during the winter. And so all of the members, they're working on from summer through early fall. That's when their feeding is concentrated, so that they're at their fattest just before they enter hibernation. But that's not how the feeding cycle works with polar bears. The stored fat allows the bears to survive in one of the harshest habitats on Earth. And a fat bear is a healthy bear. The bears eat 8 months worth of their food in spring, and between the months of April and early June, depending on what latitude they're living at. And this is critical. So this means that when bears begin the summer, they're at the fattest they will be for the entire year. And they're leanest, and therefore they're most dangerous at the end of winter, when it's still very cold. And so what that tells us is that they're not fat to stay warm. They're fat to see them through the lean months when there is no food. Now, I put together a scientific paper outlining my argument for all of this, why the models failed, and the explanations for why it didn't fail, and I was unable to get it through the peer-reviewed process. So I ended up putting it on a preprint server. So it means that it is available online. There is, as part of this service, there is a comment mechanism, so people can sign in if they disagree, and they can basically do a peer review right there that is can be seen by all of the world. None of the polar bear biologists have registered any kind of review or complaint. Now, the reason that I proposed or formatted my paper as a hypothesis testing is that this is the appropriate format for presenting a scientific criticism. And you don't have to put a collar on a polar bear to assess whether a prediction that was made in 2007 matches up with documented observations. However, people still complain that my paper can't be true because I've never been to the Arctic and put a collar on a polar bear. So one of the things that happened was that at the end of November, I woke up literally to find that this paper had been promoted by media outlets worldwide, a paper called Internet Blogs, Polar Bears, and Climate Change Denial by Proxy. There were 14 co-authors on this paper, and I knew 5 of them. Ian Sterling, the most senior polar bear expert in Canada, Stephen Amstrup, who had been the lead author on all of those USGS reports of the predictions, Michael Mann, that some of you might know, who's a fellow who thinks very highly of himself, an Australian psychologist by the name of Stephen Lewandowski, and an American biologist named Eric Post, whose name I had come across in some of the biological literature. The rest of them I've never heard of before and have never encountered in looking at polar bear literature or even biological literature that is pertinent to these marine mammals. It was an attempt to silence legitimate scientific criticism. There was no effort made to address any of the criticisms I'd made regarding the polar bear conservation. It was a vindictive attack, even though they had sort of singled me out to smear my reputation and sort of smeared all internet blogs with the same cloth, and the media went along. There were articles all over the internet. My daughter-in-law's brother in Germany emailed me and he said, "You're on the front page of the newspaper. What's going on?" Even the New York Times. Meanwhile, my university was busy doing some silencing of its own. By the time the Harvey paper came out, I had already been expelled from the university's Speakers Bureau. Now, this is a volunteer organization where professors and graduate students can go out into the community and speak to community groups about topics that they're knowledgeable about. And I had been working with the Speakers Bureau since 2009, and I had been speaking about both evolution and polar bear conservation to adult audiences. But in 2016, I had added a specific talk directed at school children because teachers kept requesting that particular talk. It was part of the school curriculum for them to talk about polar bears, and they were ecstatic that there was someone at the university that could come and talk to the children about polar bears. However, every year, when there was a new registration, basically for the Speakers Bureau, so that they had all of the titles correct, and my claim, it turned out when I sent I said, yes, I'm happy to do it next year. And she said, well, there's a new rule that adjunct professors have to get the approval of their department head before they can operate and do the lectures. And my department head refused. And she said it was claimed that my talks to children had lacked balance, and that therefore she could not, that she appreciated concerns about academic freedom, but she could not approve my future participation in the Speakers Bureau. I was aware of no complaints registered by students, parents, or teachers up until that point. If there had been complaints, no one told me about them. So this became an academic hanging that went on behind closed doors. No one involved me. No one asked me about what was involved in my lectures, what went on. And then this summer, my department refused to renew my adjunct professor status, which I had held for 15 years. And they did not say why. They just said, the application has been denied. Thank you for your service. The university has refused to answer any questions from a journalist about these actions. And they recently issued a statement that did not explicitly deny that I was let go for political reasons. Very carefully worded language to cover up what they don't want anyone to know. Now, it's important to emphasize that adjunct professors have no rights. This is an unpaid position. What they did was entirely legal. However, it was an unethical attack on my academic freedom. And yet here I am. So I'm continuing to talk to you and to others about polar bears and why they didn't die off as predicted, and I continue to plan to do so. But here's one final question, I think, that still needs to be asked, and that's how many polar bears are really out there? Because one of the things that I've noticed is that the polar bear specialists have been minimizing the estimates for the global population for decades. Now, this is the same graph we had earlier about September sea ice, and this is 2005. And essentially what they seem to be saying is that polar bear numbers rose rapidly until 1996 and then leveled off. Now, as a biologist, this is implausible to me that all of the other species of marine mammals that we know that were given protection from overhunting, in fact, have continued to increase. And I suggest that, in fact, the numbers have continued to increase when you take into account the subpopulations that have never had a survey done, like East Greenland, some of the populations in Russia. And when you take some of those numbers into account and you use what we know from populations that have been surveyed recently, what you get is a more plausible estimate at 2018 of 39,000, with a range of about 26,000 to 58,000. And this is what it looks like with the error bars. And it may sound outrageous to come up with that large a number. But in 1986, polar bear specialist Ian Sterling thought there was probably about 40,000 bears in the world, based on the same criteria that I said. If you account for the areas where we knew there was no counts, that there were a lot more bears out there than the official numbers showed. But if that was true in 1986, 39,000 as the current average is really conservative, even if you've got a potential for 58,000 as the maximum, considering that it's been more than 30 years since 1986. So I don't find my estimate to be outrageous. I think it's entirely supported by what we know about polar bears around the world. And so I can only conclude that there really is no climate emergency for polar bears, that their canary in the coal mine for climate change turned out to be an outstanding survivor of climate change. And what do plenty of polar bears mean for Arctic residents? Polar bears are really dangerous predators. They kill people, they damage properties, and they have a relentless quest for food, whether they're fat or thin. Even fat bears kill people, and they also damage property. Bears are now a danger throughout the year, throughout the Arctic year-round. We hear reports, well, this is the one, remember from Russia just in February this year, where the more than 50 bears descended on this small village and refused to leave. Eventually, they had to call in the army to get them out. They blamed it, of course, on climate change. But so here's just some recent incidents from Svalbard in north of Norway here. In July 2018, a polar bear guard from a cruise ship was attacked by a polar bear. He was an armed guard, and only through the rapid actions of his companion was he actually saved from being killed or mauled by this emaciated bear. Now, these were, two guys out there armed looking for bears, and they still got attacked. August 2016, shut down an archaeological site because the bears decided to come for a look-see to see what was going on. So they're kind of everywhere. This is a remote cabin in one of these islands. Broke down the door. From the looks of it, the door was ripped off its hinges. Got in and just destroyed the inside of the cabin. This is just recent. These two guys are out in their powerboat, decide to stop for lunch and go for a bit of a walk. Bear swam over, investigated the boat. This is what it did. Ripped the boat apart. Now, as has typically been done for all of these kinds of incidents, it was blamed on lack of sea ice due to climate change. But in this particular instance, Svalbard has had the most extensive and thickest ice that it's had in decades. And in virtually every case where I go back and look at the sea ice specifics that are involved in these kinds of incidents, it's never conclusive that sea ice can be blamed for these incidents. So just to wrap up, the points to remember: that summer sea ice is not crucial for polar bear health and survival. The ice is critical for late fall through late spring. After that, ice is optional. The bears can be on land or on the sea ice, but in either case, they tend not to eat very much. Less ice in summer is beneficial to ring seals and bearded seals. Since 2005, even though sea ice dropped to levels not predicted to occur until 2050, polar bear numbers did not plummet as expected. Polar bear numbers are now the highest they've been in 50 to 60 years. Since 2005, polar bear specialists have repeatedly underestimated the global population size. Current size may be as high as 39,000, but officially is 26,000. Thriving polar bear populations put the safety of Arctic residents and visitors at risk. And recent attacks on my integrity are undignified and unethical attempts to silence legitimate scientific criticism. Now, some people object to me telling children that polar bears are not currently on the brink of extinction, even though this is undeniably true. Despite summer sea ice loss, there is no climate emergency for polar bears. And lastly, if there's no climate emergency for polar bears, then there's no climate emergency, period. Thank you.